Um, Welcome everybody to the final session of the 2020 Virtual Provincial Training Conference. We're happy to have you all here to what we believe is an important session on looking at maintaining your boundaries in this work so that you're in better shape to do it for a longer time. There's been a lot of interest in the course, and we're happy to have this as a closing session. I want to acknowledge that we're working from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and that you are all working in areas around the province in territories stewarded by nations around the province, and we thank them for that historical protection of the land and look to working positively in the future. I'll introduce Mary. Mary Devan is a clinical counselor in private practice in Nelson. She has a master's in counseling and a master's in sociology. She's worked a lot, as well as having a private practice, worked a lot with nonprofits, helping them with teaching and different workshops, and also as a clinical supervisor. I'll leave you to fill in any more details, Mary. And then just briefly, I want to give people a heads up before we start that we have a couple of announcements at the end of the session. So if you could please just stick around just right at the end. Kate Murray at Legal Aid BC has a survey that she wants to give you a heads up about. We also have surveys. Ours are short, but both things that we think would be helpful. Okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So as Lois was saying, my name is Mary Devan, and I do live here in Nelson. You can probably see my home office behind me here. Just as a caveat before we start, this is the first time I've done this kind of webinar. Normally I can see people's faces, and so bear with me if I stumble along the way. And I was also struck by the number of people attending this workshop. And I know that it's challenging times for many of us. And I know that, working remotely with COVID has also presented probably new challenges to us in terms of setting and maintaining boundaries and what those boundaries look like. So we're going to cover some of that as through our time together today. And so just to give you an idea of what to expect, we're going to talk a little bit about boundaries in general, what might tell us that maybe our boundaries are slipping a little bit, a bit about what we can control and what we can't control, COVID and how that's affected our boundaries, and also the idea of, what do we need for support to help us maintain boundaries and also to look after ourselves during these challenging times. So we're going to cover a lot of those things. I'm going to stop every once in a while and check the Q&A, probably about every half an hour, to check the Q&A and just be able to respond to people's comments and questions as they come up. So if anything strikes you along the way, please feel free to send me a comment or a question, and I will get to that. And also, if any of your questions have to do with any particular challenges in the work as it relates to clients, please keep those questions general, because we want to make sure that they're general and that they're not about specific clients because of confidentiality, and so we don't want to share people's personal information during the workshop. Maybe just a little bit more about me. So what I've been doing over the last 6 months since COVID started is that I've been working with a fair number of nonprofits in this area, talking about exactly this, talking about boundaries, supporting teams as they work from home, getting used to working from home, and people's concerns about clients too during this time. So as well as I'm also in private practice, as Lois was saying, and I see clients. I work a lot with healthcare providers who are also challenged during this time. Yeah, So that's that. That's sort of the introduction part and what to expect as we get going. You'll notice the first slide here where it says boundaries and burnout prevention. The reason I've added the burnout prevention is because it's so important to think about maintaining boundaries in terms of this. And because if we let boundaries slip, it's kind of a slippery slope. And we can kind of get confused, we can lose our way, and that can ultimately lead us to feel kind of burned out in our work because somehow the balance has slipped off. So that's why that's the title, Boundaries and Burnout Prevention. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So the boundaries defined, this is really just a straight up dictionary definition of boundaries. To be able to see it both ways. One is that a boundary is defined as a line that marks the limit of an area or a dividing line. What divides me from another? We can look at boundaries that way, and we can look at boundaries as a limit. What is our limit? What is our limit to our sphere of activity? What is our limit to what we can control and what we can't? And what is the limit in terms of our scope of practice? So in that way, the boundary is sort of more about what's around me rather than what I put between myself and another. And we'll talk about that a little more as we move along about how we conceptualize boundaries. Before we go to the next slide is going to address this a bit, and it's also going to ask you to reflect a little bit. So I want to leave a few minutes on the next slide for you to be able to reflect on your own conceptualization of boundary. And as we're allowing a bit of time for that to happen, this would be a great time. If you have something that you want me to cover during this 2 hours that you're particularly interested in or concerned about, please send me a message through the Q&A. And as I'm asking you to reflect, I'll be looking at those comments to make sure that I address what's most important for you during the time that we're together today. So if we could go on to the next slide. So this is about self-awareness, and I know a lot of people have done probably a lot of workshops on boundaries. I'm sure you have a lot of information on boundaries. And when we talk about boundaries, you have an idea of what those are. But really, I think one of the most important pieces of boundaries or maintaining boundaries is this idea of awareness of yourself, of how do you know when a boundary has sort of started to slip a little bit? What is the indication to you that might be happening? So before we kind of get more into that, I'd like to ask you, when you have an idea of a boundary, what is it that you visualize? Do you see it as something that you put up between you and somebody else? Or do you see it as sort of more of a sphere around you? Is there a symbol that comes to mind when you think of the word boundary? Like maybe a picture in your mind or a word? And then also, how do you know and what does it feel like when you set a boundary or when that boundary is challenged? So this is really kind of about thoughts you might have, reactions, responses you might have, because the more we are aware of ourselves, the more we're able to catch something as it's happening. And so that's why these questions matter. So I'm going to invite you just to take a few minutes, and just think about that in terms of yourself. And particularly think about, do I see a boundary as something that I put between myself and another? Or do I see it as a sphere around me? So just take a couple of minutes and think about that. I'm going to go to the Q&A and just check in.
Mary, following up on what you mentioned about confidentiality, I forgot to mention at the start that we don't usually mention the names of people when answering their questions, because then that keeps any facts that might be confidential.
For sure. Yeah. Okay, I see a couple, I think, in the chat and one in the Q&A. So I'm just going to go over to the chat here and have a look at that too. Okay, perfect. So there's a couple of here that I'm going to be talking about actually as we move along. So one is the working from home and how that affects our boundaries, what that means. We'll definitely be working on that. And then also another one around what is within my scope, what's my limitation or my ability, and what is my capability? All great questions, all great comments, and we'll be covering that too as we go along. So I'm just going to close that. I'm going to go back to the Q&A. I think there's another one here. Oh, okay. And then there's one here about also adhering to our service mandate. We're going to talk about that too. So perfect. Okay, so I think we are all on the same page in terms of what we're going to cover. Again, if there's things as we go along, please continue to add them to the Q&A, and then I will be spending some time in as we go along, reading them and responding to them. Oh, this is a good one. So I won't mention this person's name, but their analogy is that it's sort of like skiing within the boundaries of a ski area. You can ski outside the boundary, but it's dangerous and there may be consequences. So this is, I think at this point, maybe I'll talk about this a little bit now too, is that definitely, you know, we have choice around the boundaries we set. Not in all cases, of course, like, you know, sometimes we're confined, the boundary is very clear, sometimes in terms of what our role is, and we stay within that role. But there are times when the clarity isn't there so much. And we make choices day to day about what we define as our boundary. And this is a good question because there's probably always more than that we could do. There's the piece around, you know, this is what I do. This is what I do that's within the scope of my role. And then there's this other question of if I did more, would that actually be in the best interest of the client? And we're going to talk about pros and cons to moving a boundary around. So that's a great one. We'll come back to that. Okay, so I hope you've had enough chance here to be able to think about, you know, how you might visualize a boundary, what symbols might come to mind, and also, perhaps almost most importantly, is how do you react when a boundary is challenged or you're uncertain about what boundary there is to set? So that's, I'm going to leave you with that. We'll come back to it, but I'm going to leave that for now. So if we could move to the next slide, that would be great. Okay, so maintaining boundaries is not an easy thing. If it was an easy thing, we wouldn't have this workshop and nobody would come. And so it's challenging, and it also goes really, I think, to the heart of our self-care. And but also it's not easy to maintain a boundary. It is not easy to say no. It is not easy to say I've done enough. It's not easy to close with clients sometimes if that's what we need to do, or to keep within a time frame. They're challenged. And so I think sometimes we get surprised if somebody doesn't, in quotes, respect a boundary or pushes up against the boundary, wants something even though we say no. And I think part of it is we can help ourselves if we can expect that those boundaries will get pushed, that people are not going to necessarily want to hear the word no, nor are they going to want to know that you can only do a certain role, that you can't be everything. And, you know, I know that when you're an advocate or you're supporting somebody who's vulnerable, that they look to you not just for what you can provide to them, but also who you are And when you have good relationship skills and you get along with people, sometimes people will want you to do more for them than what you can do. And so expect that you're going to come up against that. And also to expect that, when you have a boundary around time or your role, that you'll probably have to keep restating that to people. And so not to expect us to do that once, but probably just on a regular basis, you'll be called upon to be clear about what you can offer, what your role is, what your time availability is, all of those things. And then also professional boundaries are a one-way street. So it's our ethical responsibility to stay within the limits of our role, to be clear on what those professional boundaries are. The clients have no responsibility for boundary in terms of ethics. And they may not have the same understanding of why we have them, or the same understanding of why a boundary that we have is important. And then the last thing is to know your triggers, to know when you find it tricky or hard to hold a boundary that you've set, or to stay within either your role or your time. That, we all have particular things that might trigger us, that might pull us to do more than we can reasonably do. And then it becomes harder. Once you open the boundaries up, it's harder to shut them down, if you know what I mean. It's like if people expect you to be there for them in a bigger way than what you can manage, what you can sustain, then you have to pull the boundary back. And that is difficult to do, and people will definitely push up against that. So, those are just a few ways that, examples of where it's tricky and it's not always easy to hold a boundary. You also may have ideas yourself, so please send them to the Q&A if you do, and I'll stop probably in about another 10 minutes and just make sure I review the Q&A so that I'm responding to what people are saying. Okay, if we could move on to the next one. Okay, so these are possible triggers to why, again, it might be difficult to set or hold a boundary. So one of them is kind of a feeling of guilt. And the guilt might be just having a hard time saying no. It may also be the feeling of, maybe I could do more. Am I doing enough for this client? It might be that the needs of the client are so high that it's difficult to be limited in what you can do for that person, limited within your role or your availability. And so that can also trigger us to do more. Lack of services, I think, is a really big one, is that, and because I hear this from different people a lot, is that the services, for instance, somebody might say the services in my community just aren't there, or the services in my community are not picking up where I want them to pick up for this client. There's some gaps in services. And I think that's particularly true as well through COVID, is that the services may be lacking, and they also just might not be what they were before. There might be challenges in other agencies and other programs to provide the same level of service for different reasons. And so sometimes we overfunction in our role because we're picking up in what we perceive to be lacking or what is lacking. The other possible triggers are expectations of clients, that we provide more than what we can do. Sometimes in our work culture, the boundaries aren't clear about what is within our scope and what isn't. And so therefore it's hard individually to know how much to give and where the line is. And sometimes expectations of funders also can impact our ability to set a boundary. So there's boundaries around, what the scope of our work is, what the scope of our role is, what clients expect. And then there's also, where are we in terms of our capacity? And, each client that comes in is only aware of what their need is. They're not aware of all the other things that you're holding and juggling. And so sometimes that can be difficult too. And then overlaying on top of all of that is the broader social context of, kind of what's happening in the world, COVID, how to offer services within a pandemic, how to manage people's anxieties, not just only in terms of the issues that they're coming to you for, but also other anxieties that they may be holding. So you can see there's a lot of things, I think, that impact and trigger us and impact the difficulty of holding whatever that boundary is. And I want to go back a minute to talk a little bit about the first slide or maybe the second slide, which was around the definition of boundaries. And if I imagine that the boundary I'm setting is between me and another, then it can sort of sometimes seem like I'm putting something up between me and my client. And if I put something up and I keep it there, somehow I'm protecting myself from compassion burnout, from the client themselves. But I mean, I'm just going to be, clear about what my thoughts are around that. And you can obviously have your own thoughts that might be different from mine. But if we put something between us and somebody else, it can feel even more triggering when that boundary gets pushed against. And it can also be sort of almost like a defensive reaction that we have, because whatever the boundary is that we've set outside of ourselves, if we feel like it's being crossed or broken down, we can have a lot of feelings of reaction towards that. But if I think the boundary is really something around me that I carry, then I'm more in control of that energy that's around me than I am if I put something up between me and another. So just in terms of the felt sense of that, I think there's a difference between those two things, how I perceive it. And so some of what we're going to talk about today is holding the energy closer to you and being protective, not from other people, but being protective in terms of being aware about what is going on for you and how depleted you are, how much energy you have, that kind of thing. Okay, if we can go back to the other slide that we were on. Okay, and then the next one. Perfect. So why it's hard to just say no. Lots of times, when we think about boundaries, we think about saying no to something. And obviously it's very hard to say no to people. And it's hard to feel like we're disappointing somebody if they have a high need. So some of the things that are part of what we're doing, I think, is how we hold compassion and empathy and still have a line, still have a boundary. How do we stay with the desire to be helpful, which most of us are in this line of work because we have a desire to be helpful. And the desire to be helpful and compassion, sometimes it can feel like I can either be compassionate or I have boundaries. And ideally, we would want to have both. We would want to be able to say clearly, this is what I can offer without guilt, and also to stay compassionate and understanding of why somebody might be disappointed in that. Also our desire to be helpful, 100%, we want to be helpful. And sometimes I think we get caught in looking for solutions to problems that are unsolvable. And so when somebody tells me that they have a problem, when somebody comes to me with a problem, it is not my problem to fix. The people that come to me own their problems, they own their struggles, they also own all of their strengths. I'm there to provide the service in the best possible way I can. And providing services in the best possible way I can means that I want to be as clear as possible about what my role is, when I'm available, when I'm not available, how much I can offer, and where my position starts and stops. And the clearer I am at the beginning and the clearer I hold that along the way, the less I have to worry about disappointing somebody because I've been clearer about it from the beginning. So, and sometimes the solutions the problems that people bring to us, some of those problems are unsolvable problems. And when those problems are unsolvable, that means obviously we can't solve them. Our role is to do what we can do within the scope of our role and offer what we can offer and be as human with people as we possibly can. And also understand that we don't own people's problems. We're only there to help within what we have to offer. So I think those are just a few of the things that kind of come into play when we say no, or what's tricky about setting a boundary. And I just noticed the time now, it's 2:30. So I'm going to take just a minute and I'm going to look at the Q&A. And if anybody has anything that they want to send, please do that now. And I'm just going to check to make sure we're on track and see if there's anything to speak to. Okay, so one of the questions somebody had was, are creating boundaries the same as compartmentalizing? Do strong boundaries mean weak empathy? For instance, is it not true? Okay, the beginning of the strong boundaries sometimes and have poor empathy for clients. Yes, I think that can be true. I think that it depends again on how we hold boundaries. And so
are you wondering what those initials are?
Yes, what are those?
Yeah, that's the Ministry for Social Development and Poverty Reduction.
So poverty reduction.
Income assistance distributor.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. No, thank you, Lois. I think sometimes, this isn't about, I would only be telling myself a story of, why I think people do what they do. But I think sometimes that if we have moved into burnout or we're feeling overtaxed, that it can get in the way of maintaining compassion, and boundaries can start to look unfeeling and reactive. And again, I think the more clear we are about if a boundary is around me and I'm not expecting, I can still be available to people. I can understand their need, but I also can understand that I can't meet all of their needs. Then that's a bit different than, I think, behaving in a way that makes people feel badly, or that sets up a boundary, again, that puts something between me and another. Someone else has asked, I'm finding it difficult to really tell how some clients are doing because a lot of our appointments are happening over the phone. Yes, that's tricky. Some people can present really well on the phone and then they end up in crisis. And I think Lois's screen's in the way of that. Because if I feel I've missed something, whereas if we were meeting in person, I may have been able to see they're on the edge from their body language. Yeah, definitely. If we're meeting over the phone, let's talk a little bit about pros and cons, I think, of meeting over the phone. The cons definitely is that we can't see people's body language, so we miss something in the communication. On the other hand, sometimes, though, I think because we can't see the body language, we have a chance of being able to really hear the tone of voice differently and to be able to pick up something from that as well. And so you have to work with what you have. And if you're providing services over the phone, you want to be able to see how you can make it work for you the best way you can. So for instance, if I'm listening to people over the phone, I take notes. I don't do that when I see people face to face, but I do it when I'm over the phone. And sometimes I attend to people's language a little bit differently. I attend to the tone of voice a little bit differently. And I can track things differently because I'm also not sidetracked by the visuals either. So I think the visuals can both help us to attend to people's nonverbal language, but sometimes can be a barrier in some ways. And so if we're just listening to people over the phone, we're listening a little more intently, or at least we have the possibility to do that. So I would suggest that no matter which way you're providing the services, that you want to be able to make it work for you, to be able to see how it actually might help and to capitalize on that. So I'll just put that out, and that may or may not be helpful to you, but that's kind of what I found providing services over the phone. Somebody else talks about feeling sorry for their client because of language issues. And I think that in terms of the language issues is, and over the phone too, might be more of a barrier as well. But I think, again, what you're commenting on there, I think, is the empathy and compassion we have for clients. We don't want to lose that. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't want to lose that. We want to be able to, I think, we want to be able to continue to be open with clients and to be able, and that's what I mean by, I don't think boundaries has to close us down. I think we can be open with clients. And the more I know about myself, where I start and where I stop and what it is that I can offer, and the clearer I am about that, the more open I can be with that, because I know what I have to offer. And so, but yes, I think that there's going to be lots of different issues that might spark our compassion for clients, or where we recognize that they're really struggling. Another question here is, my supervising lawyer has me write out a letter of engagement for each client I open a full representation file for, which helps delineate what I have said, what I will do. It establishes boundaries. And also when I think the screen's in my way again here a little bit. Let's see if I can move it up. No.
Says when I have to close a file, I write a letter to say why.
Yeah, so I think that's a great example of something that would be helpful, because again, you're communicating in writing what it is that you said you'll do. And so that you have those boundaries in writing, which you can always go back and refer to. And also when you're closing, so that you can go back and you can refer to that too. I mean, that might not help. That might not happen in every instance for everybody. That might not fit. But I do think it's, again, a really great example of how to be clear with people right from the get-go. And then when you're closing up as well. So that's great. Thank you. Then there's a question here. Any tips to deal with handling a failure of services, a gap in services? What strengthens our boundary when we really can't help? And I think that this is such a good point, because this is a question about, is a problem solvable or is it not? And that there is going to be a limit to what you can help with and what you can do, which means that you're also possibly going to witness somebody's disappointment. And you're going to hear that they have a need that can't be met. And we're going to talk about this a little bit down the road, about how to take care of yourself. Because definitely, whether no matter whether it's limitations in services, gaps in services, there are going to be things that happen that are outside of your control to change. There may be, depending on your community, ways of getting together to talk about potential gaps in services, work with interagencies in terms of that, being able to advocate on a larger scale, or that may be somebody else's role in your organization. But again, I think what's being said here is, when the question is asked, what strengthens our boundary when we really can't help? I'm not sure if it's about strengthening the boundary there or if it's about acceptance that you can't solve some problems and that there are going to be some things that you can't help with. And so that's kind of the accepting what is within your limitation. So let's move. Hang on. There's another one. I missed one. Can you speak a little more about this? It is not a question of whether I can do more. I know I can do more. But if a client comes in at the 11th hour, it puts me in a position of running around at the last moment. I don't feel I can say no. As I say, I could do it. But the last minute calamity is both hard to say no, but also a source of heightened stress. So another really great point is that sometimes people come in crisis in the most inconvenient times, and also where there's just not enough time in the day. And this is another point, I think, about, and we're going to talk about this, a bit of this in a little while. But if somebody comes in the 11th hour and you're still at work, you can do whatever you can do to help that client with the amount of time that you have available. This is a question about whether or not you go into a stress response when your client is stressed. This, again, is about if the boundary is around you, this is about how do you stay in your own energy, even if the client is heightened. If this is a question about, do I stay longer? Then if you stay longer for one client, do you stay longer the next time that same person comes in? Because every time we move a boundary out, we realize part of it is having to make a decision. Is this a one-time thing? And if it is a one-time thing, can I say to this client, normally I don't stay past, or I don't work past a certain point. I'm doing that today for a specific reason, if that's your choice. If your choice is that, no, I'm working until 5, I leave at 5, then it's a matter, I think, of saying to somebody when they first come in, we have X number of minutes left here. The office closes at 5, and I'll be able to help you until then. If that's your choice, then you're also, anytime you make a choice about whether you stay a bit later or you don't, if you cross a boundary or you don't, it's about how you speak to it. And also the awareness that if I stay behind one time, if I'm not really clear about this, is this person going to expect, with good reason, because I've opened the boundary up, is this person going to expect then that I'm there to meet their need the next time? Or if they know somebody who's also a client and they say to that other client, so-and-so stays until 5:30, then I've set an expectation up, not just for that particular client, but for other clients who may know that I've opened the boundary to one particular person. So I think part of the thinking around boundaries is, even if sometimes I feel like I'm doing what's in my client's best interest, how might that ricochet in a different way the next time? So if I lead somebody to expect that I can do something, I've opened the boundary up. That's one of the issues there, I think. Somebody else commented and said, sometimes people just need to know that they are heard. There might be no solution to their problem. Absolutely. And this is the place, I think, around maintaining compassion, around being able to listen, but also managing stress related to that. Because again, if I listen to somebody's problem, I want to be able to listen. I want to be able to show respect and concern, but also it doesn't mean that you can solve the problem. And so this is about, again, I think, staying, acknowledging the fact, managing the stress related to the fact that some of these issues are going to be outside of your control, and also listening and having empathy and understanding can be very helpful in and of itself, for sure. Thank you. Okay. So I think we've addressed the questions that are there. So if we can go to the next slide. These are sometimes signals that might say to us that our boundaries might need attention. If I start to overfunction, so if I start to feel, especially with certain clients, that I'm doing more, or I'm doing more than I normally would, I'm spending more time than I normally would. Those are signs that maybe the boundary, you just have to keep it in check and make sure that if you are functioning in a different way with a particular client, that you're just aware that you're doing that you're conscious of doing it, that you're making a choice about it, not just kind of on autopilot. So sometimes we might overfunction, sometimes we might underfunction. And we might underfunction because we have a particular trigger, or we're affected by particular clients. And sometimes if people are coming in, or they're coming in repeatedly, a sign that we've lost a boundary actually might be an underfunctioning. Or we might notice that we're saying or telling ourselves a story about a client sometimes. And it might be an indicator that, okay, I feel like I'm depleted, I feel tired, and I feel maybe that a boundary is being pushed. So that might be a reaction of underfunctioning. We've talked about the next one already a little bit, which is I might assume responsibility for the problem, for fixing the problem. So, and I want to be careful that I'm not assuming responsibility for somebody else's problem. If I make exceptions to a boundary, I want to know when and why I'm doing it. Again, I want to stay conscious of it. So if I start making exceptions, if I start to kind of get a little slip up a little bit, sometimes we notice that if we're thinking about a lot about a particular client after hours, there's something that's gotten under our skin a little bit. Now, I have to say that this one is not atypical and normal. There may be once in a while a client that really does get under our skin for some reason, or an issue that does, or we're really worried about a particular person. We've been affected by a story we've heard. That will probably come up time to time. That doesn't mean you have weak boundaries. It means that there's a particular issue or a particular person that has really affected you. And I think at that point, it's really important to know what your supports are through work so that you can work that one through. So if it's a one-off, you want to be able to work it through, not abnormal, totally normal. If you find yourself thinking a lot about work after work, then that's a question about how do I then boundary my thoughts, right? So sometimes we think about boundaries, something between me and another, but really we also want to be able to have boundaries around our own thoughts, and to keep those thoughts in check. And then the other one is if I'm problem solving, like say I'm off work, but I'm actually thinking about a client and it's actually problem solving and I'm coming up with some ideas, I might want to give myself a bit of time to do that because something's occurred to me. That's different than perseverating about a client or their life circumstance or a problem that they have or a problem with the system. And I know that, I've worked in nonprofits. I've been in practice for about, 30 years in one form or another, worked for a lot of nonprofit settings, worked within a lot of systems. And I understand how challenging that can be. And I also know that if we put our energy into thinking about things that we can't control, then that's part of what depletes us. So we want to be aware of what are the quality of my thoughts, how much thought am I giving to something that I might even have a really good point about, and I might even be in quotes right. But if I can't change it, I don't have control over it, how much time do I want to spend thinking about it? I need to boundary my own thoughts around that. So let's go on to the next slide. Crisis situations. Okay, so we probably will make exceptions in some crisis situations. because they're crisis situations and we do the best we can, but we're responding to something in the moment. And so this may be a time when boundaries get really challenged. We've talked about this next one a little bit around pros and cons of making exceptions in crisis situations. So meeting a client's need versus setting expectations and disappointing a client in the future. So again, if we're opening a boundary or we're changing it because of a particular one-off or a crisis situation, we still want to be clear with our clients that we're doing that and that we're conscious of it and that there's a reason for it. And so it's that in that particular instance, it's compartmentalized. So we're explaining why we're doing what we're doing. And then the next piece again is doing your best for one client. What looks like you're doing your best for one client can also be harmful to somebody else who might know that you've done something for that one client, but you're not doing it for them. This is true in smaller communities for sure, where people tend to know one another. And it may or may not be true in larger cities, but definitely in smaller communities, especially in rural communities, this can become an issue where the optics are, you may think that you're working sort of in private with a client doing your thing, but sometimes the optics in a community can become such where all of a sudden you feel like, oh my gosh, like there's a lot of expectations on me from a lot of different clients or a lot of different referral sources or service providers. And so we want to be careful and aware that, especially in small communities, that how I engage and how I work is going to be seen by other people. It'll be seen in ways that are intentional, and then it'll be seen in ways that I'm not intending, but that people are starting to see me in a certain way. So you may have already found that in your community, phone so-and-so, refer this person to so-and-so, they're great, they're going to do X, Y, and Z. And all of a sudden, sometimes the expectation of you becomes more than what you've actually think that you're putting out. So I think that's something to really think about in small communities. And then the third one is that, for people who have more than one person in the office, is that how you do your work impacts how your colleagues do their work, or at least how they're perceived. And so if I'm going beyond what the boundaries are of the other people that I work with, does that affect then how they're perceived? Or does that then create an expectation for other people that they do more? So you see this sometimes in work cultures, right? Like in a work culture that says, well, we do everything for everybody. It's really tricky for one person to have a different boundary in that. And I think that's where it can really be helpful to talk about some of these things as a team, because then you can come with an understanding, or at least be able to talk about, what do we do? What do we offer people? And are we in alignment around that? And so I think sometimes those discussions around boundaries can also be very helpful in the context of a team, people working together. Let's go on and do one more slide, and then I'm going to go back to the Q&A. Okay, so COVID and boundary issues. So as I was saying before, I've been working with a lot of agencies in the community where I work with around working from home and what that does, a number that does to our maintaining boundaries and how tricky this is. So in terms of challenges in working from home, there are so many, right? Like, people have talked about kids coming into the room because their kids are home, or having real challenges in keeping to time, because it's really easy to read emails at the end of the day or to start work early in the day. It's a bit more challenging to leave work and go home because I'm working at home. But still, these things, I think the structure is still really helpful in maintaining boundaries around this. So some of the things sometimes that I talk to people about is differentiating my work persona from my personal persona. So if I come into work, what is my setting within my home? Do I have a place where I can work, that I can even have symbols up in my office that remind me of my work, but also might remind me of things that are important to me that help ground me? What is it that grounds me? And the use of symbols in my office space can do that. It can really be helpful with that. If I dress for work at the beginning of the day, if I work outside of the house, I'm going to dress for work inside the house. Even if I'm just talking to people on the phone, I'm going to move into a different part of myself and use, it's like putting on a uniform. I'm going to put something on, and at the end of the day, I'll take that off and get into, my sweats or my pajamas or whatever that might be. And so I'm going to mark the difference between work and home, even if I'm working from home. Even more importantly, I think, when we're working from home, we also want to be able to take breaks through the day. And I hope people are getting up, through this presentation and moving around a little bit, to be able to take breaks, to get outside and just walk around the house or run around the house or just take a breath of fresh air. To take breaks through the day is really helpful, so that when I come back into my home office or the space where I'm working at from home, I feel like I've taken a little bit of time for myself and now I'm back to work. So this idea of being at work and working to keep that work persona going. The other thing people have talked a lot about around boundaries is, how do I know if I'm doing a good enough job if I'm working from home? Some people have told me, like, I feel like I'm slacking off because I do take breaks, or I'm not on the screen all the time. And, I go to my kitchen instead of going out into the hallway and seeing coworkers, and then I'm in my kitchen, and is that okay? I kind of feel like I'm slacking off a bit. And other people who would say, I actually feel like I'm over functioning because I tend to feel like I'm at work all the time, and it's really easy for me to check emails or to check my phone messages after work. I don't have the same clear structure as I do when I go to work. And then the other piece around the boundary issue is that we're responsible in terms of doing the best we can for our clients, in terms of using our knowledge, our professional development, our resources in the best interest of the client. That's our responsibility. But we're not responsible for the client outcome. We can only be responsible for what we can control, not for what somebody else does or for ultimately their outcome. We also have pressures of funders around, for a lot of us anyway, around what the expectations of outcomes are. And sometimes that can impact our boundaries as well, where we feel like, well, maybe I have to see more people or do more things because there's this, pressure that I'm feeling to do more. And that's, again, I think, a conversation to have sometimes with the people that you work with, to be clear about those things, but also to really stay grounded in the fact that your responsibility is to do the best you can within your capacity and your role for the good of the client. And there's limitations around what that means. And you can't be in control of other agencies, what other people are doing, or ultimately the client themselves. That's their boundary. And so I suppose this is the other piece that comes into it, is the people that we serve, we do what we can to advocate for them. But some of the change that's more personal for them, more what they would need to change themselves, is within their right to autonomy. And people have a right to change, they have a right not to change. And so that's part of the boundary as well. So I'm just going to take a minute here now and go to the next Q&A. Oh, this is good. Okay. How do you turn off your work mind to enjoy your free time? I find that my brain comes up with solutions when it has time and space, which is when I'm off work. Tight budgets and constant pressure from funders means it's very hard to make time or space to really think during my work day. And again, I think that if this is like a one-off, or if you're actually problem solving, you're coming up with some good ideas that you didn't have time to think about between 9 and 5, then I think that's, that happens. We do that sometimes. We do think on our off time about a particular solution for a particular person. If it's a one-off, I think that's just normal. But if it becomes like I'm just thinking a lot about work, especially again, when I leave my office and I go into my living room, there's a very small transition between my office and my living room. There's a bigger transition between my office in town and my home. I have more time in that distance to let go of work. I close the door to that office. I let go of work. I drive home. I come into my home space. There's more of a marker that tells me to let go of one thing. We have to work really, really diligently when we work at our home office. The idea of changing your clothes is one idea of kind of taking off the work persona, taking it off, letting it go. You're not your work. And so you want to be able to take it off. The other thing too that I suggest to people sometimes is that, as well as, kind of changing your clothes from one role to the other, is also the use of a symbol. So for instance, if I put a bracelet on at the beginning of the day, and I say to myself, I'm going to leave this bracelet by my computer in my office at the beginning of the day, I'm going to put the bracelet on, and at the end of the day, I'm taking the bracelet off, I'm leaving it by the computer. It's a symbolic way, it's a symbolic message to myself that says, the day is done, leave it by the computer, work is finished. And so it's like I'm giving myself multiple messages that says, I'm off work now. So those things can really help, to use symbols as a way of reinforcing that message to yourself that says, I'm done, I'm off work, and now I want to let it go. And the piece around being able to shut your mind off, it takes practice. It takes practice to do that, and you can do it. It's kind of like, having to put a big stop sign in front of your face sometimes that says, okay, just stop. And then you might find yourself thinking about work again. It creeps in. And then it's like, okay, no, just stop. I'm not being paid at, 11 o'clock at night to work. I'm not being paid for this. This is not my job. This is my free time. And it's sort of like you have to talk to yourself like that, like kind of, kind of zip yourself up a little bit, and because otherwise, if we're not on top of it, this is where it kind of bleeds, our life bleeds in between work and our home life. We kind of start to be affected by our work, and our work starts to affect how we personally feel. Your clients' lives are not your own. Work is not your life. Work is part of what you do in your life. And hopefully it's something that you enjoy or that you get a lot of value from, and that it gives you something. You want work to be able to feed you, ultimately. But also and we're going to talk about this in a little while, but also working with that balance to make sure that you're not constantly flipping in and out of work thoughts. Somebody's mentioned here that they find going for a walk can help to shut off the work brain, which is fantastic. Yes. It gives a chance to process and decompress like I normally do in driving home from work. Even just 10 minutes outside helps. Yes, absolutely. We're going to talk at the end of the presentation about what helps, I'm going to use the word self-care. I don't really like the word self-care, really, and I'll talk about this in a little while too. But the idea of getting outside, going for a walk, and being able to just, yeah, kind of transition from one role to the next. Great idea, going for a walk after work. I also find going for a walk at lunchtime helps too, just to be able to get out. Now I see there's no more questions, but I can't see how to close my screen here. Hang on a minute. There we go. Okay. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide. So COVID has affected us. It's also obviously affected our clients. And it's affected our clients in multiple ways. So accessibility to services may have shifted. For some people, trying to access services through a computer is really challenging, and they just don't have the computers, or they might not have phones. So it might be very difficult for them to come. And also, if people are used to sort of, depending on the agency that you have, if people are used to being able to come in person and just dropping by to ask for help, and they can't do that anymore, a lot of what they'll be getting when they phone agencies is a voicemail, which for some people can be really triggering. So that's definitely had an effect on a lot of people. Barriers to accessing services. So just being able to get in contact with, I mean, it's hard enough as professionals to get into contact with some services these days. Really challenging for clients and very frustrating. And so both of those things are true. And also, there's not much we can do about that. And it is the way it is right now and won't last forever, but definitely for some people, this is going to be incredibly frustrating, as well as difficulties with referrals and gaps in services as well. Of course, helping client with housing concerns right now or with any kind of court-related matters. Again, a lot of these challenges are things that are bigger than what you or I can control. And so this is part of, I think, where we don't want to hold these issues personally, because they're not personal issues. They're systemic issues. They're issues that we might all share together and collectively. They're not personal issues. So we don't want to be personally triggered by issues that are not personal issues. They're real issues. I get that and I understand that. But you don't want it to affect your personal self. Does the effect of COVID on clients challenge you in your setting or in maintaining boundaries? And so I want to ask you that question, because I want to make sure we have time for any questions or comments that are specific to this very odd time we find ourselves in. So I'll just take a minute and just let you respond to that. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions or comments right now, but I'll keep my eye open and I'll come back to it if there is any. So perhaps we can go on to the next slide. Other potential boundary issues. So the first one, I don't mean to say at all that you shouldn't have friendships with colleagues or coworkers. I don't mean to say that. But I do think that where it can impact boundaries is that we can talk about work outside of work, and it can start to be what perpetuates a difficulty holding kind of a work-life balance. So it's, and I think it's on the next slide, we'll talk a bit more about this, but it's about deciding or making a decision or making a choice that would say, okay, if we go out together, or we're friends, how much time do we want to spend talking about work? Do we want to help each other to sort of limit how much we talk about work so that it doesn't become bigger? And we may do that in terms of debriefing with colleagues after work. And again, debriefing can be really helpful if it helps us to let go of what's bothering us. Debriefing ultimately is a way that I can let go of something that's on my mind, to process it, put it through, take it to completion. Sometimes when we're talking with friends outside of work, we might think we're debriefing, but sometimes what we're doing is we're just kind of perpetuating whatever it is that we're upset about and feeding into one another as we do that. And that can look like support and supporting one another, but it can also be in this kind of negative spiral vortex loop, if you know what I mean. So it's just something to be aware of. It's something to think about. You know, how, if I have friends and colleagues at work, how do we use our time? Is our talking about work helpful to us, or is it also kind of bringing us down? Other potential boundary issues are a lack of clarities and roles. And I think that this is probably an ongoing living topic of conversation around the difference between what does support look like and what's the difference between support and counseling. How do I stay in my role of support, and how do I support without giving the impression that I can do more than what I can actually do? And that is a tricky topic. And I think, again, the more we think about boundaries as something around me and a structure in my day, the more I can kind of stay on top of that one and make sure that I'm not in any way misleading people to think that I can provide more than what I can actually do. Other potential boundary issues of sharing of information. I think this might be particularly true in smaller communities, but probably in larger centers too, is since kind of we're working from home and things look a little bit different, do I find myself sharing information about clients in a different way? Are things a little more informal? And in that context, are we slipping at all into sharing more information than we should, or about or talking about clients where we really aren't talking about it in a professional standpoint, but more in a almost like a gossiping kind of thing? And that can happen really easily. You know, one way of thinking about that is if my client was outside my door and I'm talking about them and they hear me, would I feel okay about them hearing what I'm saying about them? And that gives me an indication of, oh, okay, like is how I'm talking about a client sort of verging on gossip? Again, I need an outlet to be able to talk about something in a safe setting. I need an outlet for dark humor. I need those outlets, but I want to be careful about the context that I'm doing that within. And so this kind of sharing of information, how I'm talking about clients, again, this goes back to my own awareness about what I'm doing. You know, is my boundary slipping around this one at all? Other potential boundary issues might be, am I advocating for a person, or am I personally accepting or taking on their problem and I feel like I'm fighting for something? Am I advocating, or am I fighting for this person? Am I personally involved, or am I in my professional role as I advocate? That's another kind of boundary slippery slope. And then also closing with clients is, do I know when my role is done? Do I know when to close with clients? Am I holding on to clients in more of a general supportive role and our actual tasks are done? And if I'm doing that, how long am I going to do that for? And again, how am I clear with clients when and why we're closing? So those are some of the sort of boundary issues that can come up in our work and sort of in a larger context. I'm going to go back to the Q&A because I see a couple of people have responded here. Okay, so somebody said here, at the beginning of COVID, I took client calls whenever they came. I reset the boundary once there was a bit more normalcy and we all had a bit more certainty. Yes, so this place about when do I respond How frequently do I respond? Am I calling people and responding whenever they happen to call me, or am I setting more structure in my day that says I'm available from this time and this time? Or if I happen to say I have a client who phones me quite often or who emails me quite often, I might then with that particular person say, you know, I respond to calls within this time of day, or I don't always get back to emails as soon as I read them. I'll get back to your emails. If you do email me, I'll get back to your email within whatever that time you might set, whatever that boundary might be, 24, 48 hours, whatever it is that fits within the context of your role. But it can help to sort of set those boundaries ahead of time too, so that people are aware of your availability and are aware they might not hear from you right away because you're not in front of your computer all the time. And I would say, even say you work until 5 and you happen to look at your emails after 5 and you feel like you want to respond after 5, you might want to think about saving that email until work time the next day before you send it, because people can see when you send an email. And so if you send an email at 5:30 but you're done at 5, then it doesn't really give the person a clear idea that you're available to 5. It says really you're available to 5:30. So you want to be kind of careful about that one too. Somebody else said, what to do about simply being overloaded at work when the burnout isn't really about a lack of boundaries so much. It's just having too much work to do and feeling guilty and dropping the ball. Well, you can't be everything to everybody, and there's no possible way that you're not going to drop a ball when you got too many balls in the air. So I'd say, and I don't know the context of your work, whoever sent that one in, and so I don't know how much could be done around addressing kind of that workload within your workplace. But definitely, this is again about really kind of, and I know when you feel tired or when you feel overworked, that it can feel stressful. And when we have stress, we feel things emotionally. And it's hard to move to a place of going, okay, what's the actual issue here? And how can I put words to the issue itself, right? And so I think a piece of that is being able to, I guess, maybe have conversations about what a reasonable workload looks like with somebody within your workplace. Now, again, I can't give specific advice. I don't know the context of your agency, nor is that within my scope, not within my boundary. But I do understand when you feel like you got so many balls in the air that you're going to disappoint somebody. Somebody is going to be disappointed because you won't be able to keep all of those balls in the air all the time. But again, if that's the nature of your work, that's not your personal issue. I understand it's affecting you personally, but that's about how much work you have. That's about the nature of your work. That's not about your ability to do the work. And those are two separate things. So, when I hear the word guilt, I hear a personal feeling of being affected by something. And we want to help you be able to, I would say, differentiate the fact that when you have too much work to do, then that's not about you personally not being able to do it. That's about the context of how much work there is. Somebody else asked a question, can you elaborate on the difference between advocating for somebody and personalizing or fighting for somebody, and why the latter isn't a good idea? The personalizing something, the fight, comes at, I think, a potential cost, because if you're fighting for your client as opposed to advocating for them, the fighting takes us, when I think of the word fight anyway, and maybe we're even talking about the same thing, but when I hear the word fight, I hear how much stress that would be in my body and how much energy that takes. And that I'm coming from a place of a tight jaw and a clenched jaw, and I'm in fight mode, which means that I'm using a lot of internal energy when I'm in that mode. If I'm advocating for somebody, I still might be providing the same information. I still may be saying the same thing, but I may not be personalizing it or feeling the emotion behind it as much. And that's the boundary I'm talking about. And so that's that, just to kind of clarify what I meant by that. It's a great question. Okay, so let's go back to, perhaps we could move the slide one more. Perfect. Okay. So these are practices that help, and I'm really interested in hearing from other people about this, in terms of what helps. So when I've been talking with different teams about some of these issues, these are some of the things that sort of we've been talking about. So this being able to slow down. And that means even if you're busy at work, sometimes if we're busy and we're in like a stress mode, then as we stress, our jaw gets tight, our muscles get tight again, and we're using a lot of energy and probably not taking time to breathe, feeling like we don't have time to breathe, right? Which is like, of course we have time to breathe, we breathe all the time, but it can feel like I don't have time to take a breath. And so that might say to us, okay, if that's how I feel, then actually what I need to do is to slow down, is to take a minute to breathe, to let go of the tightness in my jaw and to kind of drop my jaw and relax my muscles a little bit and not be in a state of fight or flight, and to be able to slow down even if the world around me is busy. And in fact, it's probably even more important to slow down if the world around me is busy, because I want to be able to respond to things rather than react to things. If I'm speeded up inside and I'm stressed and I'm tight, I'm probably in a reactive mode. And especially at work, I want to be responding, not reacting. So responding has more of that quality of grounded and slowing down. Other things that might help is being able to have the support of colleagues and being able to consult with people. And again, debrief. But when I think about debriefing, I'm talking about debriefing during work hours and using it as a way to let something go. So the question might be for me then, is am I carrying something that is not mine to carry? Am I carrying the burden or the weight of somebody else's life? And it's not my burden to carry. I can be empathic, I can be compassionate, but it's not my burden to carry. I've got my own, but it's other people's are not mine. And so being able to debrief can help to let go of something that isn't yours to carry. Other practices that might help are starting your day with sort of a mindfulness practice, whatever that might be for you, or grounding at the beginning of the day. So just taking a couple minutes, and again, when you're at work, when the workday starts, taking a couple minutes first before you check your emails to be able to just relax your mind, to be able to close your eyes for a minute, take some breaths, and think about, okay, how do I want to approach my day? How do I want to be during the day? I can't control what comes at me. I can't control anything about what comes at me, but I can control myself. How do I want this day to go? How do I want to be with whatever comes up? Even if it's something I don't like, sometimes, we feel like, when things happen that we don't like, that there's something wrong. There's only nothing wrong. It's just that those things happen, through the day that we aren't crazy about, that we wouldn't want to have happen, but they do happen. And so if I have a practice at the beginning of the day that reminds me of that and says, yeah, things might go wrong today. Something might happen that I don't like, And how do I want to be with that if that happens? So I'm prepared for it. I'm not caught off guard. We talked about this next one a bit, which is limiting the discussion of work after hours. And again, this is not about something that you like. It's not like something you have to do. It is just something to think about, and to think about if I'm talking about work when I'm not at work, whether that's with colleagues and I'm out with them after work, or it's when I get home. And if I go home and I talk about work, does it help me to let go of it again? If it helps you to let go of it, great. As long as you're not obviously breaking confidentiality, talking about clients. But if you're talking about how the day was for you and it helps you to let go of it, great. But sometimes it can just go on. And we just find ourselves talking about work a lot. And that's where you might want to be able to almost sort of set yourself a time that says, I'm going to go home from work, and for this amount of time, I'm going to talk about work, and then I'm going to stop. I'm done. And so having a boundary around that might help. Any kind of practices that help you to let go of what you can't control. This is going to look different for different people. So some of the things that I think about here is I think about, spiritual practices, being able to give something over to something that is bigger than you, realizing that there's a bigger picture than the whatever narrow picture we have in any given moment. So for some people that might look like spiritual practices. For other people, it might be, physical movement and just being able to move that stress through. For some people, it might be about being in nature and going for a walk and just being able to notice, like, oh, look, the trees are here. In my view, outside my window, the mountains are there. These things have been here far longer than I have, and they'll be here way after I'm gone. So to be able to give myself perspective, things that help me to bring perspective can be really helpful. And also taking mini breaks throughout the day. So getting up and moving around, like I say, going out and getting some fresh air for even a minute, just being able to walk out, or walk around your house, get outside a little bit, but just kind of shaking it off and giving yourself a few mini breaks. I would be really interested to know what other people do that helps. What other practices do you do, or things you think about, people that you hang out with, whatever that might be? What is it that you do that kind of helps you to have this kind of boundary between work and life, to have a balance? I'm just going to look at some comments here. Somebody has said, having routines for various client scenarios helps. If I do things the same way each time I'm presented with a set scenario, I can ask appropriate questions that direct set solutions. I would like to have a poverty law flow chart to ensure I caught everything. Not being in a spot where my boundaries are pushed means I can focus on appropriate things. Perfect. That is really great. I think being able to know what to do in a situation can really help, whether that's a flow chart, a safety checklist, whatever that might be, but to have something that you can reference that says, I've asked these questions, particularly if they're issues that are common issues that you see quite a bit. That's a really great one. That's a really good structure. For some people, structure and having lists is like absolutely the way to go. So that's a good one. Somebody else says that they knit, sew, and quilt. So I can tell you, for me, that would stress me right out, but I can understand why some people it works for. So that's great. But yes, having like creative projects and being able to do something, like with your hands or creatively that gets you out of your head. Perfect. Somebody else says that they walk their dog and go outside. I'm a dog lover. I love my dog. And whether I'm walking my dog or not, just being around my dog makes me feel good. So I can resonate with that one. It says, I connect with nature and go for walks to have self-reflection and put things down that don't belong to me. Perfect. Yes. Being able to get out, and to be able to have nature around. And again, connect with something outside of your head that has meaning. Yes, perfect. Someone else says, my partner and I take the dog for a walk as soon as I'm done work to help with the transition from work to home. Excellent. Great strategy. Someone else said, pre-COVID, our house had a 3 p.m. mini yoga session. Oh, perfect. Where we could push tables aside and do a 15 to 20 online yoga session. It was amazing. So pre-COVID, your office had that. So I wonder, is that a possibility to do that at home even? I do a mini workout at my lunch hour, not every day, obviously, but and most days through the week, just to kind of shake it up a little bit. But I love that, like having a particular time where you set things aside and you do something in the middle of your day. Great. I find talking to coworkers and making sure I've done absolutely everything I can within my capacity. Yeah. Then when the thoughts creep in on days off, I know I've done my best. And if things go wrong for someone that's outside of my control, also yoga, music, and exercise. So that is a really great point too, is that if I'm unsure, if I've done everything I can, to be able to talk that out, or if I have like an ethical dilemma and I'm not quite sure what to do, to be able to talk it out with other people to make sure that you've checked everything off the box can help you to let go of it at the end of the day, which is great. And yoga, music, and exercise, fabulous. On breaks, both my colleagues and I walk, which is another great thing, being able to get outside. Like I say, even if it's just to get around the block on, and take mini breaks, but to get outside and go for a walk is perfect. Yes, and then this next one says, I have my desk and laptop in a different room. So when the workday is finished, I can walk away and not look at my workspace. Yes. If you can have, I know that for some people it's challenging during COVID because you weren't set up to work from home because nobody worked from home. And then all of a sudden you're supposed to work from home. And so, that's caused a lot of difficulty for some people too, is that, if I had had time, if I was told 6 months ago or 6 months before COVID started that I was going to be working from home, I would have done things at that time to set myself up to work from home. But this came completely out of the blue. And so if I wasn't already set to work from home, now I got to scramble. And so that's been tricky for people, again, like to kind of all of a sudden have the expectation that I can just transition really quickly into working from home. Also, might I say, the same thing may be true for people who are back at the office or maybe going back to the office. As much as the transition might have been difficulty to transition home to work, the transition might be challenging now that people have gotten used to it, to going back to work. And it might feel like a little bit of an odd shift in terms of your boundary and being back to work. That might happen as well. But yes, if you can have your desk and your laptop in a different room that you can walk away, that's ideal. That's perfect. Great. Thank you. I'm just going to go off of that now. Okay. So if we can go to the next slide. It's getting dark in my room here. I'm just going to switch my... Oh, this is a little bit on self-care. I said a little while ago that I have trouble with self-care. I don't really have trouble with self-care. I mean, I think, we all have to look after ourselves, obviously. But sometimes I think self-care can become one of these things that becomes another expectation. And the first thing I had put on this slide is if self-care feels like a chore or one more thing that you have to do, it's probably not self-care. It's probably something that we think we should do, but the shoulds or putting it in as one more thing can feel, it's like an oxymoron. It's like, I'm trying to look after myself, but really the idea that I should be looking after myself brings more pressure to me. So that's just, I just wanted to kind of bring that in. I think when we talk about really looking after ourselves, we're talking about doing the best we can to find a balance between things. And I think one of the other things that may be a cue that our boundaries might need some help is that if my balance is off in terms of how much I think about work versus the rest of my life, and how much work is affecting me emotionally and getting in the way of me living the rest of my life. It means that the boundary that I have around work has somehow shifted, and that it's starting to affect me, I suppose, really, but it's starting to affect me personally, and maybe how I think about myself. You are not your work. Work is one part of you. And so this kind of, and even when we find balance, might I add, is that very seldom do we don't find balance and stay there. We find balance and then we tip off again, and then we got to get back into balance again. It's sort of like just a regular thing. And sometimes it's easier to be in balance than other times. So that's really normal. We talk about having compassion for clients, but really, I would say, really need to work on having compassion for ourselves, and in whatever way that might look for us. So if we're feeling tired and we feel like we're doing a lot for other people, then I want to be compassionate with myself about that and understand that I'm doing the best I can, and that what the best looks like one day might not be the best the next day. So I might have less energy in some days, or I might have my own personal challenges that are also affecting my work life, and I need to have compassion around that, and also have ways to deal with that so that I can have this boundary around work. Anything that helps us to get out of the head and into the body, to move the stress out. The more we sit and think about stress, the more stress tightens our body. And so if you think about that, think about stress being visceral, and it's just in the muscle tension, and it's in the jaw, and it's in how tightly I hold my eyes. It's tight. It tightens me up. Then the more I think about whatever it is that's stressing me, the more I'm likely to continue to tense up. So I want to be able to have strategies that help me to get out of my head and embodied and move it through, get it out, discharge it. I think one of the most important things around this idea that we have of self-care is actually to allow others to care for you. And when we're in this kind of role, we're so used to, a lot of us are so used to taking care of other people and we're not necessarily so good about allowing others to care for us. We're not necessarily always so great at with our own vulnerability. And I think that that's a practice as well. But I also think that it's the balance too. It's part of the balance is to allow ourselves to be cared for by others and be able to kind of relax and let go a little bit more. I'm just going to go down to the Q&A. I see that there's things on the chat, so I'm going to check the chat. So it says here, I'd like to do a mental health wellness check-in with my clients and have them tell me what they are doing to manage stress and self-regulate, and strategies to help stop feelings that are strong and reactive during these times. I do art, hike, kayak, and I play music that sets my environment each day. That's fabulous. That's great. And the idea of doing a mental wellness check-in with your clients, I think the other benefit to that is that it reminds us to do that ongoing with ourselves too. Also, we can then share ideas between our clients and ourselves around how do we self-regulate and how do we kind of let go of some of those feelings that are, like you said, reactive during these times. And like doing something creative, fantastic, hiking, getting in the mountains. One of my favorite things is kayaking. And just to be able to get out and move and to see the beauty around us, or to create beauty, and to play music, or for some people, it might be listening to music or dancing. Such a great thing to do. And my other favorite thing to do is arrange coffee chat with other women. Oh, no kidding, eh? That's such a such a great thing too, is to be able to get together, whether it's virtually or not, to have coffee with people or to get together just to have a chat. It doesn't have to be about anything serious, but just to be able to connect with other people. And then the other piece that I would add to is the importance of laughter, to be able to have a good laugh, to be able to make one another laugh, to be able to watch a program that makes us laugh, anything that makes us laugh. That's because, and a sense of humor, having a sense of humor about life in general, even the absurdity of life, can be such a helpful thing too, in terms of staying in balance. Perfect, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go. I think that might be our last slide. Is that right? Yes, I believe that is the last slide we have. So we're coming to an end. We still have a little bit of time left. If anybody else has any questions or any comments, anything that they want to share or cover before we finish.
Looks like people have been asking along the way, but may not have more. Do you think?
Yeah, I don't see, I see a comment from somebody, and you're very welcome.
Oh, are we there? Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there have been a lot of questions along the way, which was great. Or a lot of comments and suggestions, so.
Great.
Okay.
Well, so maybe we will end it there then. And I wish you all well. Thank you so much for participating and also putting up with me as I stumble along in my first webinar. So thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mary. Now, I know the question will come, and maybe it's already up. Are your materials up on the web on Sched or no? Can we get copies of your materials?
Yeah, because I sent them in already to.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah. So I sent them in, so they should be up.
Okay. If they're not, we'll get them up shortly.
Yeah.
Maybe not today because I have boundaries. But
well done, Lois. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. As you will see from the chat that's going on now, it's very much appreciated. I know people will turn to the materials. So thank you.
Great. You're very, very welcome. And thanks again, everybody, for participating. And I wish you all well.
Thank you.